Window to China and Xinyu has reached out to the hundreds of Chinese community, Asian community, and American community on performance, interview in education, politics, culture, etc. It's a link for all the communities. Xinyu and Judy Wu, the publisher AC Business, are making joint efforts to promote the program on Newspaper Weekly. Window to China and Xinyu is a 30 minutes long English program. It will be available on YouTube, Facebook, Google+, AC Business News by keywords Window to China and Xinyu. Miss Meredith Miller. Ms. Meredith Miller is Senior Vice President of Trade, Economic, Energy Affairs and Director of NBR's Washington, D.C. office. Welcome to you. Can you introduce yourself?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a real treat for me to be here today. And I also want to wish you a very happy new year and good fortune to you and all of your viewers in the Fairfax County area.
The same to you, thank you. So I want to learn more about your specialty. I know you are a specialist for South Asia, but tell us more about your job. What do you do?
Great. So as you mentioned, I'm the Senior Vice President for Trade, Energy, and Economic Affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and I also direct our Washington, D.C. office. We're an independent research institution. Our headquarters is in Seattle, Washington, and we have our Washington, D.C. office because we were founded in memory of Senator Henry M. Jackson from Washington State, who was a foreign policy leader in his public service in the U.S. Congress, in the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And our mission is to connect experts with policymakers. So our office here in D.C. is a really important part of the work that we do in working with the top researchers around the world and to bring that expertise to the U.S. Congress and the U.S. administration.
I heard about, I learned from newspaper, you have hosted several conferences recently. Can you talk about this?
Yes, actually earlier this week we had a conference highlighting a 2-year research initiative that we've been running with the support of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation that is aimed at looking at what the geopolitical implications are of North American energy self-sufficiency. So as you know, there have been a lot of headlines about the shale gas revolution here, the rapid increase in U.S. oil production, along with more production in Canada and Mexico. What that means is that overall, we will no longer be directly reliant on imports from the Middle East. And this is happening at the same time that Asia's demand and reliance on imports has continued to grow. So what we wanted to do in this initiative is look at ways the United States could work more closely, especially with Asia's largest consumers, China, Japan, and South Korea, to promote global energy market security.
I know China has become the largest, energy market demand now, so they need it. So today we're going to talk about China's energy. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about China's energy history?
Yes, I'd love to. China, as you know, is the world's most populous country. It's also one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And what that means is we've seen a transformation in China's energy consumption, but also the impact that it has on world markets. And that's true whether we're talking about renewable energy, whether we're talking about oil or gas or coal or hydropower. China's expansion has just been remarkable. Historically, starting in about the 1960s, when China's relations broke off with the Soviet Union, what we saw was a very strong policy focus on domestic production and self-reliance. And China has very large reserves of coal and also a fair amount of oil. So historically, coal and oil have dominated the energy mix. Starting in the 1990s, as China's economy was growing, China switched to becoming an importer of oil, and we saw policy focus begin to shift in that era, really looking at ways to secure oil resources overseas, and a much bigger impetus on encouraging the national oil companies to go out into resource-rich areas and make investments and stimulate more production, particularly in the oil sector. So that was a very important evolution of Chinese policy. I would say another very important historical trend as we come into 2015 is an increasing emphasis in China in looking at environmental security as well. So that concern stems from rising protests in China over air quality issues, over water quality issues, and that spurred the Chinese government to look at ways to decrease the role of coal in the energy mix. So starting in about the mid-2000s, the Chinese government placed a greater focus on developing renewable energy resources. And those are also have an important energy security dimension because that decreases the need to import fossil fuels to meet energy demand.
Which countries now China import the energy mostly from the Middle East or from other countries? Which countries, most of them?
Well, if we're talking about oil, right now China's reliant about 50% on outside imports to meet its oil demand, and this is projected to go up to about 2/3 by 2020, and about 2/3 of that will be coming from the Middle East. On the gas side, China has really diversified its relationships quite dramatically. So there's a lot of gas being piped in from Central Asia. China and Russia last year concluded a deal for gas that had been negotiated for 10 years and finally was concluded. And China's also really working to import more liquefied natural gas from Australia, from Qatar, from Africa, possibly from North America, although that's not very well developed. But the infrastructure investments are going in. There's 7 new receiving terminals for liquefied natural gas on China's east coast, and they're planning more. So I think for gas producers around the world, one of the huge questions that they have in thinking about their future is how successful China will be in incorporating more gas into the energy mix and decreasing the role of coal.
What are the China's gas and the oil realities? I mean, how about domestic energy in China?
Well, as I said, for China, especially as they look at decreasing the role of coal in the energy mix due to increasing environmental concerns, the reality that they are facing is increasing reliance on global energy markets to meet their oil and gas demand. And this is driving not only trading relationships, but also diplomatic relationships. Many of the world's oil resources are controlled by governments in the Middle East and national oil companies, and China's increasingly being put in a position where they're investing a lot more diplomatic resources in those countries and relationships because they need to be able to secure the oil resources that they need. On the gas side, there are going to be some big challenges that China will need to address in order to successfully incorporate more gas into the energy mix. That includes putting in place the necessary infrastructure, but also figuring out pricing reform. So prices have been set by the central government. They're trying to move towards more of a market-based pricing system, but it's enormously complex because the cost of the gas coming in from Central Asia is different than the gas that's going to be coming in by the ocean, and I think policymakers there are going to have their hands full in trying to figure out a way to smoothly move towards more flexible market-based pricing.
What are the current policy and the consequences in China now?
Well, gas I think is a really interesting story. So for gas, China has set a target to basically quadruple consumption of gas in the energy mix by 2020. So as of 2012, about 70% of China's energy demand was being met by coal, about 18% by oil, and that's mostly in the transportation sector, and very small amounts from renewables, about 1%, gas around 4%, and nuclear around 1%. And the government's really putting a huge emphasis on increasing, those smaller pieces of the pie. So we see very rapid expansion in the nuclear sector. On gas, as I mentioned, they're trying to quadruple gas as a ratio of the energy mix, and in fact, it has gone up to 7%, so up from 4% in the last 2 years. And for renewable energy, the story is equally dramatic. The Chinese government set a target last year for 14%, very dramatic increase in the past 3 to 4 years, and fell slightly short of that, but is really working with the major producers in China and the state grid to reach the targets for 2015.
I know the environment become more and more concern for Chinese people. What is the environment cost do you think is government can put?
Well, that is a really important policy question for Chinese policymakers. And one thing that's also an important element of China's energy history has been the tremendous government emphasis on economic growth as the #1 strategic policy objective. And what that means is that the environment was often sacrificed. So China's become the manufacturing center of the world, and there were very weak, the environmental regulatory agency is very weak. There was not a lot of oversight, and a lot of industrial pollutants have been dumped into the water and the soil. I was reading that it's estimated that 70% of China's water supply is polluted, which is a tremendous burden on the economy and also the health of the people. And when you're talking about farmland, there was one study done last year that estimated close to 20% of farmland soil is contaminated by heavy metals from improper disposal of industrial products. This has become a huge issue for the Chinese people as they become increasingly concerned about food safety, about having water that they can drink. And then we've all seen the headlines and the pictures of the air pollution situation in Beijing in particular, but this is definitely not a problem that's exclusive to the capital. There are many areas of China that are suffering from very high levels of particulate matter in the air. And that has huge ramifications for health, which is going to impose an economic cost on the government. So right now, I think especially since 2012, the Chinese government has been very focused on ways to clean up the environment, but it is going to be a challenge because, as I mentioned, the environmental regulatory agency really needs to be strengthened. In China right now, coal remains the dominant fuel source, but the government has done a lot to ensure that coal-fired power plants have scrubbers in place and that they have the technology to use to clean the air, but those aren't always turned on because that means that they're going to run less efficiently, and sometimes the operators would rather have a healthier bottom line than turn on those scrubbers. So they need to really work on enforcement going forward.
I think it's hard for Chinese government to work on that, make a balance of energy supply, security,
yes,
and related to environment issues. It's hard, right?
It's very hard. And many countries are facing this challenge, but in China it's particularly striking. But there's a calculus that has to be made between economic growth, energy security, and environmental security. And what I hope is that there's growing awareness that the environmental costs really do impact the long-term economic benefits, and that we'll see more thinking beyond the next 5 years to the next 15 years in terms of the impact that's going to have on the next generation.
How do you think Asian Pacific countries react to China's energy big market demand needs?
Well, that's a very complicated question, and interesting one too. It really depends which country we're talking about, I think. So for example, for Russia, they look at this as an opportunity. They have great resources of gas in particular, but also oil, and they look at China as a key consumer and a market for their products. For some other countries in Asia, particularly some who've had historic rivalries with China, like Japan and South Korea, I think there can be a concern that China's dominance of world energy markets, particularly growing relationships in the Middle East, might somehow shut them out. I don't think that's a well-founded concern because we do have a global energy market and free-flowing movement of oil in particular, but I think sometimes you see that kind of thinking emerge. For many other countries in the region, and for Japan and South Korea as well, China also represents an opportunity to integrate the market more closely. And I mean that both in terms of energy supplies. I know South Korea is very interested in whether or not the pipeline deal that China struck with Russia, and when I say South Korea, I don't mean the government, many experts there are interested in whether or not that pipeline could be added onto to bring some of that gas to South Korea, which is almost exclusively dependent on imports. And for many other bordering countries in Southeast Asia, there are opportunities to also link up the grid in terms of power generation and provide that more efficiently on both sides of the border. So I think there are a lot of opportunities and sometimes a little bit of concern.
When we talk about energy, we cannot separate with trade. Talk about a little bit PPT so we can learn more.
Oh, I'd love to. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is a very ambitious multilateral trade agreement that the United States is negotiating with core trading partners in the Asia-Pacific region. There are 12 parties to the TPP that include Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Canada, Mexico, Chile. And all of these countries are looking for a way to knit together their existing free trade agreements with each other into an overarching agreement that would liberalize over 40% of global trade. This is a flagship trade initiative for the Obama administration, which announced its rebalance towards Asia and really highlighted the TPP as the economic dimension of this strategy. We are in the very final stages of negotiations on the TPP. Prime Minister Abe is probably going to come to Washington, D.C. in June, and the negotiations between the U.S. and Japan, particularly on tough issues like automobiles and agriculture, are a major question mark in the negotiations, so everyone's looking forward to a breakthrough there. And we have the Republican-led U.S. Congress very actively campaigning and pledging support to grant President Obama trade promotion authority. And that's viewed by many in the U.S. and the region as a prerequisite for successfully concluding the TPP. And what trade promotion authority does is it basically gives the president the right to submit a trade agreement to Congress, where it will have a yes or no vote instead of with amendments. If we don't have that, many of our negotiating partners will fear that the U.S. Congress will renegotiate the agreement. So many in the region have been looking for that congressional grant of TPA, I think, before they move into the very, very final stages. But the reports coming from the Obama administration and from Congress are very optimistic that we're going to be able to conclude and pass the agreement this year. And I certainly hope that that's the case.
Yeah, for other countries, a little bit concerned Congress in U.S. Window to China and Xinyu has reached out to the hundreds of Chinese community, Asian community, and the American community on performance, interview in education, politics, culture, etc. It's a link for all the communities. Xinyu and Judy Wu, the publisher AC Business News, are making joint efforts to promote the program on Newspaper Weekly. Window to China and Xinyu is a 30 minutes long English program. It will be available on YouTube, Facebook, Google+, AC Business News by keywords Window to China and Xinyu. President Obama really support like environment, weather change, energy change, some policy like that. I heard about the EPA, if that's correct term I say. So what do you think China and the US can find common ground to strengthen the energy policy or make sure the environmental issues get better?
Yeah, actually this past November there was a major announcement from the US and China on cooperation on climate change, where the Obama administration made some very important pledges to reduce U.S. energy intensity by 28%. It's between 25 and 28%, with 28% as the target by 2020. And China made some very important pledges to cap coal consumption and also bring down overall energy intensity by 2030. So that announcement gave a lot of hope to people around the world who are looking forward this year to the next round of the UN climate change negotiations, that the two major consumers in the world, the US and China, might be able to lead a way forward on an agreement. The US and China are also cooperating very closely on developing carbon capture and sequestration technology for coal, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that are being emitted from coal consumption in the US as well as in Asia, and cooperating very closely on developing clean energy. China is also very interested in fostering its own shale gas revolution, and there are a number of partnerships between the US government and China to exchange information in that. And in fact, US companies are very involved in working with Chinese SOEs to look at whether or not that's going to be possible.
So I don't understand the green energy, and clean energy, and also some renewable energy. So what's your point on this kind of research or market?
So the US and China established a clean energy research center that's aimed at fostering partnerships between companies in the solar and wind and renewable energy space in particular. So that's a definite area of cooperation. There has also been some friction between the US and China when we're talking about solar and wind in particular. There were some high-profile cases last year where the US Department of Commerce sanctioned some Chinese solar manufacturers for dumping in the US market because US producers were alleging that Chinese subsidies to those companies were giving them an unfair advantage. So it's an area where we both have an interest in seeing more solar and wind energy being used. It's also an area that China has identified as a strategic industry and is really prioritized in terms of its own industrial policy. And the US, as you know, we have a very strong technology sector and a lot of companies here who are very active in that space as well and looking for future opportunities. So as we navigate the trade relationship on renewable energy, we're also seeing some government-led partnerships to try to foster a more collaborative relationship in the future. I hope that answers your question.
Right. So yeah, I just heard about read the newspaper. When they talk about renewable energy, it seems everybody just like it, but it's hard to pass in the Congress or Senate. That's because the money cost is a lot. Why? I mean, it's hard to pass.
You mean a negotiation for the UNFCCC? Mm-hmm. Well, if we're talking about climate change, there are still a number of skeptics in the US Congress that climate change is a man-made phenomena. And that has really limited the ability of Congress to exercise a leadership role in addressing climate change issues. And it's also hampered to a certain extent the leeway that the executive branch has in moving forward on international pledges to combat climate change. For renewable energy, we've also seen a fair amount of debate in the US Congress for how much and to what extent the Congress should be providing tax incentives for homeowners to install solar panels, for businesses to incorporate more renewable energy. And some of that is driven by budgetary concerns. We're in a very tight fiscal situation, but I think some of that is also driven by the skepticism I mentioned about whether or not climate change is man-made and how big of a threat it actually poses in the future.
What is your general view on the energy security, and the environment issues in global level?
I think we really need to see a more integrated discussion of those two issues. Especially over the past 10 or 20 years, we've often seen them discussed almost separately. So we have discussions about energy security, which tend to be very focused on oil market security, but also countries' concerns over being dependent on imports. And then we have discussions about climate that sometimes are quite separate from the reality of the struggle that economies face in securing energy to meet their economic growth targets and continue to improve the lives of their citizens. So what we really need to do is bring those two discussions together so that we can have an honest conversation about what it's going to take to meet our carbon emissions reductions targets, and really build social acceptance and support for the fact that we need to pay more in the short term to avoid some very high long-term costs. So in my view, I feel that there's a good momentum between the US and China coming into the UNFCCC talks, but to really succeed, we need to continue to educate the public, especially in the United States and China, about why it makes sense to pay a bit more for our energy in the short term and conserve more so that we don't pay the very high costs that climate change is going to inflict on the world, particularly coastal areas, in the future.
I think very professional. Thank you for your point. Then now talk about your own life. What do you do in your spare time?
Well, as you might guess,
riding bicycle. I know you're very famous. Okay.
Well, in my spare time, as you might guess from my job, I love to travel. I'm going to be going to China later this year, and I'm very excited about that. My husband also likes to travel, so we're planning some trips for fun this year too. And I do like biking, but I'm not the famous cyclist Meredith Miller.
The same name as you.
The same name. I like to do it for fun rather than a profession.
Okay, so thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I really enjoy having a conversation with you.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.